All right, good morning.
Good morning.
So we'll be in Ruth chapter 3 this morning. And once again, it's kind of one of those weird ones where we only have one section. There's not multiple places that at least the editors have said, you could probably stop here after a couple verses and stop here and talk. And no, they just say, read all of chapter 3 and talk about it then. But this week, I guess we've been talking about relationships a little bit over the past 2 weeks, but this week it really ramps up in chapter 3, and it will continue into chapter 4, of course, because in chapter 4, Ruth and Boaz get married. And so this is the pre-marriage or pre-marriage stuff. But before we get there, there's also some lessons from just relationships between one another. And I wasn't intending on bringing this up, but then I got a call Friday night at like 11:30 from, let me back up. I got a text that was like an entire novel from my sister, and I had to get her on the phone and said, I'm not reading all of that. You're going to have to just tell me what's going on. It kind of led into this idea of how the world defines our relationships and how God defines relationships. It's not that my sister was having trouble with her boyfriend. No, she has those, but she doesn't talk to me about that. She was having trouble with her roommates, which I can only say, I'm sorry you're going through that. I don't have roommates, so I kind of got out of that whole system as soon as I could. Not because I disliked my roommate when I was over at LCU. It's just I like my space, and I like not having other people in my space, and having to interact with people who sit there and dig through my stuff because they think I am hiding something of theirs. I don't. We're living on top of each other. JH rooms are not that big. But it was a long conversation, and what I kept pointing her towards is this idea of your relationship with them is different than their relationship amongst each other. Because she was complaining about, well, they left me behind when they all went to Sonic, and it just hurt, and I was like, I get it, I've been left behind plenty of times too. But also, going to Sonic at 11:30 at night doesn't sound like the best plan. You're going to go drive to a Sonic, sit in your car that's full of people who you clearly don't want to associate with because you are complaining about them. And let's all sit in there awkwardly because we're going to overfill a car cab, and now we're going to sit there, order food, and then drive back and eat it at your apartment instead of just not worrying about it. It's 11:30 at night. You don't need a soda at 11:30 at night. You don't need that hamburger at 11:30 at night because, in theory, you should have eaten. You're not all just getting off a late night shift and getting food. You're just bored. You're bored, and so you're hungry, and so you're going to do that. But beyond that, it was also things of, well, my roommates enjoy underage drinking. Okay, I don't know what to tell you about that. I know you don't underage drink. I understand that you don't want to participate in underage drinking, and you explain that to them. But by doing that, you're already putting yourself in a different position than they are. They're going to look at you differently because you are living a different life than they are. When your boyfriend comes into town, he doesn't stay in your bedroom like their boyfriends do in their rooms. Your boyfriend sleeps in his truck in the parking lot. Though it's a little weird that he's sleeping in his truck in the parking lot, it is still something that's different and somewhat expected because of who you are, how you've been raised, and in this world, the relationships that the world says you need to have in your college years is completely different than what God is expecting his young women and men to look like in their lives. And so it kind of led into this idea of the world defines our relationships completely different. jumping back into last week, Boaz is just like every other Jewish man who lives in Bethlehem. It's not like there are outsiders living in Bethlehem, because it's noticeable that Ruth is an outsider. Ruth is a Moabite, and they keep bringing it up over and over and over again. Why? Because she's standing out in the crowd. She is not like them because she is from a different country. She is of a different nationality, and something about her just screams she is not a Jew. Whether it's she has blonde hair or pink hair or whatever. It's one of those, she is standing out amongst this group that is all ethnically and religiously similar. And then we hear about all that Boaz is doing, and yet they're saying Boaz's field is much safer than all the other fields around for the widows, for the foreigners, for the needy, for the poor and the beggar. Well, why is that? Why is Boaz's field any different? He has the same law that everyone else in Bethlehem has. He has the same examples as everyone has. I think it's kind of going back to that same idea. Though they have the book right in front of them, and though my sister's roommates, they may claim to go to church, they may have a Bible somewhere, that doesn't mean they read it. That doesn't mean that they're living as God has called them. The same is happening here with the men in Boaz in chapter 2. Boaz has the book and is living a different life because of because of what he's been commanded. He is taking it to heart that, yes, I need to do whatever I can in my power to take care of these women, to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. I have to do everything in my power to make sure that when they're out in my field doing a bunch of picking things off the backbreaking labor by picking things off the ground, that they are safe and protected because it is my field that is safe and protected. Because I am their redeemer, I am their savior, I am their protector. But not everyone has that. And here we see, we see it again come up in our lives, right? Not everyone who has read the Bible or read parts of the Bible lives the same way as those who actually live what is written. I think of, there's this weird phenomenon in biblical studies. You get the Christians who have studied the Bible because they are church members, they are studying the Word of God because they feel called to study the Word of God. And that's great. That's what I do, right? That's what Dale and Dewey do. That's what all of the ministers kind of do here. They are studying the Bible because they are Christians, and their goal is to, how can I pull information out of this text and teach it to others because I feel this is the most important document ever. But then you get the complete opposite. You get the atheists, the non-believers who devote so much of their time into reading the Bible, and some will even come up with better translations of the Bible than the biblical scholars who came from the church. They will spend so much time devoted to the language and picking things apart, and they'll read the Bible over and over and over again, yet they never make the jump to that I need to follow what the Bible says. That they come to great kernels of truth, and yet they don't follow the Bible and the message of God. And it's always one of those weird, you put so much time and effort, and yet maybe there is that part of them that's saying, no, you need to make the jump. It's so easy. You already know what's there. Just make that small change and then you'll be great. Make that confession, make that jump. But because of how the world is coaching them, they will never make that jump without a little push, right? They're not going to make that leap of faith because they're so comfortable in how the world defines their relationships. They're so comfortable with doing the things of the world that they're not willing to give up those things to follow something that they've studied for years. Which is weird because sometimes you get confessions of believers who they didn't study as much. I remember when I was baptized, there were books of the Bible I had not read yet. even now there are books of the Bible that I've kind of read, but I was like, all right, I'm done reading that. Just because you can only get through Leviticus so far before you're like, all right, I kind of get it. I'm done. I can just reference it when I need to. Or when I get to Song of Solomon, I'm like, okay, enough of that. And so there is some good things to come out of it. But when was the last time you read the book of Jude? How many of you have read Jude in the past year? Just raise your hand. Okay, more than I was expecting. When was the last time you read the prophet Amos? Well, that's a bad way of saying it. How many of you read the prophet Amos in the past year? Okay, a little less of you. How about Habakkuk in the past year? All right, we're starting to see in the yearly life, we won't read every book of the Bible. We can get pretty close. But there's always that, like, we always try and do those reading the Bible in a year, but there's always going to be those like that one week that you're like, I've read so much, but I couldn't find the time this week, and so I didn't finish this book this week. And instead of falling behind trying to read twice as much the next week, I'm just going to read when next week has scheduled for me. I'm not going to jump into that, but then you miss the point. And now I'm rambling about things that have nothing to do with Ruth 3. But we kind of get the point of the world and how we treat the Bible and how we treat our relationships are all different, whether we're coming from a worldly view or from a godly view. And this week, we get a lot of weird stuff just because, and at least I call it weird. To you, it may be super normal. But at least to me, it's weird because we're not in an Old Testament context, and it's there's gaps in what we do in our practices. But I'll go ahead and read chapter 3, and then we can discuss that. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that I may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But then he lies down. No, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor, and just as her mother-in-law had commanded her, and when Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry, and he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" She answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at her feet, and not at her feet, at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another, and said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you were wearing and hold it out." So she held it and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." All right, so there's a lot weird going on here. And it gets even weirder the deeper you dig. And so this week when I was trying to put together this lesson, I really struggled on how deep we should go, because it only gets into more and more rabbit holes, and it gets a lot weirder than just saying, yeah, there's some relationship stuff going on here, and it's going to change, and it's going to be a little bit more normal next week. And so I wanted us to start off focusing on how chapter 3 opens. Chapter 3 opens and closes once again with Ruth and Naomi having a conversation. We don't know how long or the barley harvest lasted, but we know that it's been at least probably a week or two, maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks. It's somewhere in there, because the wheat harvest hasn't started, but the barley harvest has now ended, and at the beginning of chapter 2, the barley harvest was just starting. So we know Ruth has been collecting in Boaz's field for at least a couple weeks now. And in that time, Naomi and Ruth's relationship has changed. It was, in chapter 1, a very strict mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. There's not a whole lot here going on. Or there is, but it's as distant as they will get, right? They are just, we are related to each other because I married your son, and now we're family, and I'm choosing to stick with you as my family instead of going back to my family. And that dynamic changes a little, because in chapter 2 we get to the point where Ruth is more of a teacher, Naomi is more of a teacher, and Ruth is the student. Ruth does not know how to live amongst the Israelites. She doesn't know what their practices are, and so she is having to be taught by Naomi, no, what you need to do, since you are a widow, since you are a woman, what we have is a practice in which if there's a certain amount of grain or barley or wheat, when we go out and harvest, will be left behind for the widow, for the poor, for the hungry, for the foreigner, because that is what they're supposed to do. So just go out and pick it up. Well, how much am I supposed to pick up? As much as you can carry, as much as you can reasonably pick up in a day. Well, all right. Well, is there somewhere I'm supposed to go? Yeah, there's this relative. One of these fields are his. I don't know which. You'll probably find it. And kind of by luck, she stumbles upon Boaz's field. But in chapter 3, it is now changed. It is now to the change of Ruth is Naomi's mother, and no, that's wrong. Luckily, there's only one more week of this, but I will continue to get the two names mixed up. Naomi has become like Ruth's mother, and Ruth is Naomi's daughter. There is no in-law. They are now living together as mother and daughter. And you may be thinking, well, okay, but Boaz is the one who calls Ruth daughter. Well, kind of. Well, yes, he does. Not kind of, he does. He does. But it's one of those, you start to see this relationship, and I like to say motherly advice at the beginning. There's probably a lot of unwritten conversations that have happened over the past weeks. Again, Ruth has come home tired, because she's been out in the field 6 days a week. She's being taught what the Sabbath is, or maybe refreshed on what Sabbath looks like now that they're in Israel. And you have all these changes of, well, they're probably talking about Boaz more than just the one time in chapter 2 and the one time in chapter 3. And so there's probably an exchange of Naomi is realizing what Boaz is doing, and Ruth is probably playing a little oblivious, or maybe not playing. She is probably a little oblivious because she's a foreigner in a different country, and Boaz is clearly not acting like other men because he is being a godly man. But then you get the point where Naomi's also probably recognizing, well, Ruth is clearly having some sort of feelings, or there's something there on Ruth's end as well. And she's looking at Ruth and saying, I cannot offer you rest. I cannot be the one to go in when you're sick to your work. Well, she could, but it wouldn't be to the same extent. She can't go in and type up the same amount of spreadsheets because that's not what Ruth's doing. What Ruth is doing is hard manual labor, and the only way to have someone take that on is for her to get married. And so Naomi opens up by saying, let me do what needs to be done. Let me help you out here. I'm going to get you a husband. And I get this a lot on my end. It's great, but there's also a lot of unhelpful help. And some of you have been this person, and I'm not going to call you out. But let me find you a wife. There's this girl that you haven't ever seen. We'll just set you up with her. Well, what good is that? I haven't seen her. I haven't talked to her. How do I know this is going to help? Well, at least Naomi is saying, I'm going to get you a husband, and you know who it is. Boaz is a redeemer. He's expected to do this. He is expected to take care of it. And to some extent, since he is unmarried, he is expected to marry one of the women who is single and who is on his docket of who he is supposed to redeem. And it's because of my relationship with him through our family that he will be able to redeem you. And then Naomi goes on and, all right, here's what you're going to do. And you're going to go take a shower. You're going to stop smelling stinky because you've been working in the field. You're going to put your perfume on. You're going to put clean clothes on. You're going to stop slouching. You're going to go do this, this, and this. And it's very much motherly advice. It's get your elbows off the table. Stop tracking muddy shoes through the floor, through the house. Put on clean clothes. You're trying to impress. Don't do this. Do that. I have the list. I know what you need to do. Just do as I say. Which is helpful. And I think Ruth probably is like, okay, yeah, you're right. I have been working in a field 6 days out of the week. We don't really take baths in this time because you do it maybe once or twice. And even if you look into more modern times, baths only happened once, maybe a month. And that was for nobility. And then we get into the American history, and okay, it's a little bit more prevalent, but again, it's still only for the wealthy because you have to draw water up and then pour it out and go back and forth just to fill up a tub for what? You to get in it? It's a lot easier to wash yourself off in the creek. But the creek isn't clean. It's not any better than having a bath. And so you're getting somewhat clean, but you're not smelling nice, is the point. You cleaned off the spots of mud on your hands, and maybe you don't have dirt under your fingernails, but you're not getting clean like we do. You're not taking a shower once or twice a day like some people do in the United States nowadays. And so to wash up is a big deal. And yes, to smell nice is also preferable, and to not be wearing trashy clothes. And yes, Mac.
Bergan, Cindy and I were talking about this morning, that our footnotes seems to, just follow your train of thought. There was nothing romantic involved in this. It was all custom and kinsman redeemer taking care of the family. I told Cindy, I said, but she put the perfume on. She put the perfume on. That kind of makes you think like it might be something a little bit more than just.
Well, sure, and the means by which they are allowed to get married may not be the most romantic. He may not be going out and buying a ring and getting down on one knee. It's kind of just he's expected to, if you want to marry Ruth, and so who has a better claim on being able to marry her doesn't, then you can marry her. But what Boaz is doing is clearly not normal. Like, he's not giving all of this wheat and food and all this. Even if little Susie, who's also been working in Boaz's field and is living with her mother-in-law, clearly she's not being treated the same as Ruth. There's clearly some interest on Boaz's part. It may not be as romantic as any of our modern romance gestures or anything like that, but we could also say, well, what does that say about God's, I guess, design or God's emphasis in these relationships? I think of the song John Deere Green, about the song about the teenage boy going out and painting his love letter on the side of the water tower, or is it? And everyone's like, no, you should have done red. It's more romantic that way. And well, he did it in John Deere Green, and it looks good to Jolene, and it doesn't make sense to us, but it rhymes. But it's one of those where you're sitting there, and to us, it's not necessarily. I'm not saying paint your love letters in John Deere Green is the godly way, but sometimes you get to the point where you're doing something because it makes sense to you and to the person who's receiving it, and it doesn't make sense to everyone else around you. Going back to my sister, is that my sister's relationship with her boyfriend is completely different than her roommates' relationships with their boyfriends. It has nothing to do with how it's supposed to work out, but just by how they act to one another, what they do when they're together and when they're apart looks different, because what they're doing is pleasing each other in a non-sexual way. It's not a sexual relationship. It is a romantic, it is a personal, it is a deep relationship between two people, and it's centered on God. It's not centered on these other things that will fade, or these feelings. And it's kind of hard to say where Boaz and Ruth's relationship is, because that's not the main reason why Ruth is being written. Ruth is being written for a different reason, and we'll get more of this next week as well. Ruth is being written because of the story of a foreigner who is an outsider, who becomes a least of these amongst the Israelites, who is redeemed, who is saved by Boaz. And okay, great. This is a great story from the Old Testament. Why is it needed to be heard? Well, it gets to that last part of chapter 4 where we see, and Boaz was the great-grandfather of this guy named David, who was king of Israel. And then we looked at Matthew, and we can even track it back, and he was the great to the umpteenth time, or however many generations, and then Jesus Christ was born of Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem. And it's in the same location, in the same story. When it was originally written, they had no idea that Jesus Christ was who it was. The idea of the Messiah being of the line of David may not even have been that important. But they did know that David's important. There's something about David that stands out. And why is that? Well, it's because he's of this heritage, of this lineage of Boaz. And look at Boaz. Look at Ruth. Look at Naomi. Look at what David's line has come from. And so we get to this point of they're not writing, and then Boaz wrote this in his love letter to Ruth, and he said this many times, and they did this much before they had their first date, and then they had this many dates before they got married. That's not the point of why Ruth is written. That's not why this story is written. It's to give us an illustration of how godly men and women lived in the Old Testament, how it came together to serve God's will. And it's serving God's will in a way that looks foreign to the world. It looked foreign to the world then, and it looks even more foreign to the world now. Because even within the church, the message is being inundated with, you need to have relationships like the world. How can you have relationships like these? You need to be more like the world. I saw a clip of a preacher who, I think it was at UT or Austin, and he had gone and he was talking to college kids, and there was a group of college kids that was really upset that he said he had a friend who was racist. And they were getting, how could you have a friend that's so evil, so bad, that he's racist, he is supporting all of these evil things. How could you be a friend with him? Because the world says, no, you're not to have relationships with those people. And even in the church, it kind of makes sense. Why should I associate myself with evil people? I should cut them off. Well, that's not the message that the church should be preaching. That's not what the church is about, and it's not. Ruth, it shows, Boaz, why are you associating with a Moabite? Why are you associating with this person? Don't you know the evil that those type of people represent? Don't you know the twisted ways that they represent? The relationships is by those relationships with those people that I can help them. And it goes back, I'll bring up my sister again because I brought it up with her again. I guess it was closer to 1 by this point because she just kept talking, which is fine because I also kept talking, and that's great too. But it was 1 o'clock in the morning and I was getting to this point. The way we can show God to others, the way we show Christ to others, is by our relationships with them. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes people don't want to hear what you have to say about God because of your relationship with them and the things that they know about you. And sure, maybe it's one of those things that you don't have conversations about Christ when they're going out and drinking. Maybe that's not the right time to say, well, let's open up the Bible, let's talk about Jesus. And they're like, I'm going to stop listening. This is not what I'm here to do. I'm here to enjoy myself. I'm here to get drunk and party and have all this, have fun, be young. Why are you being the buzzkill? Maybe that's not the way. But if you never associated with those people, how would they ever know who God is? If you never had any interactions with anyone outside the church, how would they ever get to know what the people in the church were like? If we said, as collectively as a church at Greenlawn, you know what, we're not going to talk to anyone who isn't a member at Greenlawn. And we're not even going to talk to, we're no longer going to work with people, even if they go to Sunset, we're not going to work with them anymore. We're only working with Greenlawn members. Well, what kind of church is that? That we have become isolated. How is anyone ever going to learn about what we're talking about here? How is anyone ever going to interact with us and say anything but, oh, you don't want to be like those people at Greenlawn. They only talk within themselves. They wouldn't let you in the door because you're not one of them. Our role as Christ, as godly members, is to go out and be examples of godly men and women. To be worthy men and women. And even in the Old Testament, it's not like when Paul is writing to Timothy and to Titus and to all of the other churches, and he's saying, be godly. Show examples of what it means to be godly to the young men, to the young women. It's not a new concept. At least I don't think it's a new concept because it's right here in Ruth. Be godly in everything you do, in all your relationships, even if it doesn't make sense. You're supposed to have those friends that maybe aren't as clean as we were or we are. But you also have to think we took a bath, we were baptized, our sins have been washed from us, we've been washed in the blood of the Lamb, whatever you want to say. And so yes, now we are on a different trajectory, but we should be bringing those people along with us. Sure, they may be a racist now. Sure, they may have this idea that is leading them towards evil. But shouldn't we be the ones who are, if nothing else, if it's the conversations we have, if it's the actions we do in their presence, should we not be the ones to call them and pull them along with us? eventually they may stop fighting us and start walking behind us. And then maybe eventually they'll start walking beside us. And then they'll be walking with us. I think of it as kind of like walking a dog, right? Sometimes your dog wants to go sniff someone else's mailbox, and it doesn't make sense. You're not stopping at some mailbox, so you kind of have to pull them behind you. And then you're kind of walking faster than they are, and so they catch up. And slowly they'll be beside you, and then they'll start going out in front of you. And they're walking with you and not trying to go here or there. And I think it's the same way with our relationships. Not saying we need to treat them like dogs, because that's not the best way. It's just an illustration. We need to be that one kind of yanking the leash of, not hard, we're not trying to strangle the dog with the leash, but we need to give the small tugs and pull people and say aside and say, I'm trying to help you put this thing that the world says is evil, because it is. There are things that the world still says is evil. And then we can kind of, once they get over some of those worldly evils, maybe we can start saying, well, God also says these are evil. And so then they'll move out of that. And then we say, now let's, instead of talking about what's evil, let's start talking about what God says is good. And so let's start doing the good things. Let's start moving closer and closer to God through our relationships. And Ruth is kind of that example again as well. I talked a lot. I feel as if the bell should be ringing, but I guess we have 1 or 2 minutes for comments.
One of the movies, The Wedding Planner,
Yep.
her father was explaining to her how he met his wife, and at first they didn't get along. She said his eyes were too close together, and he got sick, and she said it turned into friendship, then it turned into love. But he talked like he did not meet her before they were married. And all the marriages those days were that way. You look back at some of the ones where, you know, they went over and just said, "You want to marry him?" Said, "You want to wait or do you want to leave now?" Said, "That's now." So women back then were treated more like slaves.
Sure.
No property.
Huh?
No property.
Property, yeah. So they kind of have to think about in that a little bit. I
Sure.
was thinking about Ruth, reading about it. Talking about Ruth chasing after the young men. Evidently, we don't know how long she was married before her husband died. So she may have not been much more than about 20 years old.
Sure. Yeah, well, we know she's a young woman because it's one of those, why would Naomi say, go back to your mother's house, to live with your family again, so that maybe they may find a way to bless you? Well, the idea is so that they may find someone else to marry you off to. Can they find someone else? And if you come with me, I don't know anyone who's going to be able to marry you. I'm not young enough to have children that would be old enough to marry you before you probably find someone else, because that is an 18-year commitment that you're trying to make, and I cannot, I will not be getting pregnant tonight, is kind of what Naomi is saying back in chapter 1. But you see it again of this Redeemer concept. Some of the language changed a little bit in chapter 3, and we could have talked about it. It's definitely not the Redeemer as my Redeemer lives that we sing in service of, because that's very much Christ is redeeming us from sin and slavery, sin and death, and all of that. It's very much, I am redeeming my right, and you are now mine as property, not as, which I guess Jesus is doing. And so I'm kind of just talking in circles again. But that's a good point. All right, we'll be in Ruth chapter 4 next week, and I'll see you guys then. Thank you.